Decolonization after World War II, independence, identity, and instability after the Second World War, the world witnessed a political and cultural transformation. Colonized nations across Asia and Africa rose up, demanding freedom, dignity, and self-determination. But independence was only the beginning. What followed was a complex journey of forging identity, managing instability, and reclaiming history. This is the story of decolonization, through the lenses of India, Ghana, Algeria, and Southeast Asia. The global context: why post-World War II shattered the illusion of European invincibility. The once mighty empires of Europe emerged from the war economically drained and politically fragile. As colonial powers struggled to rebuild their shattered homelands, their grip on distant colonies began to loosen. Across the globe, the winds of change were rising. Millions of soldiers from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean had fought and bled for the Allied cause. They returned home not as subjects, but as veterans, with a new awareness of their rights, their dignity, and a powerful desire for change. In 1945, a new international body was born, the United Nations. At its core was a bold principle: self-determination, the belief that all peoples have the right to govern themselves. This principle struck at the heart of colonial rule. But as one global conflict ended, another began. The Cold War, a tense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, quickly reshaped the world. Both superpowers saw the decolonizing world not just as newly independent states, but as potential allies, or enemies, in their ideological struggle. Former colonies became battlegrounds for influence, caught between capitalism and communism. Yet amid all this, one truth echoed louder than ever. The age of empires was ending. From India to Indonesia, from Ghana to Algeria, from Vietnam to Kenya, the tide of independence could no longer be held back. The world was changing, and the empire, as it had been known, was no more. India, the first domino. 1947. India was long considered the jewel in the British imperial crown, and in 1947, it became one of the first major colonies to break free. The Indian independence movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, had been growing for decades. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent resistance, from the Salt March to the Quit India movement, galvanized millions. Britain's exhaustion after World War II made holding on to the colony increasingly untenable. In August 1947, India finally gained independence. But freedom came with a tragic cost: partition. The subcontinent was split into two nations, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. What followed was one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in human history. Over 14 million people crossed newly drawn borders, and up to 1 million died in sectarian violence. India's challenge didn't end with independence. It was not just a political transition, it was a civilizational one. How do you build a modern nation from a mosaic of ancient cultures, hundred languages, deep religious diversity, and the lingering trauma of colonial rule? Ghana, Africa's beacon. 1957. 10 years after India's independence, the winds of change swept across Africa. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from colonial rule. Under the bold leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana declared its independence from Britain, a moment that would echo far beyond its borders. It was more than a national victory. It was a continental milestone. Nkrumah envisioned something greater: a united, self-reliant Africa, free from colonial domination and Western exploitation. The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa, he proclaimed. His words ignited hope and resistance across the continent. But freedom came with new trials. Ghana, like many newly independent states, faced political instability, economic struggles, and the heavy hand of Cold War interference. The promises of independence were quickly tested. In 1966, while Nkrumah was on a diplomatic trip to Asia, he was overthrown in a military coup, a turning point that underscored the fragility of post-colonial governance. Yet Ghana's impact could not be undone. It had lit the fuse of African decolonization, inspiring nations from Nigeria to Kenya to rise and reclaim their future. Ghana became more than a country. It became a symbol, of black pride, sovereignty, and the enduring dream of Pan-African unity. Algeria, liberation through war 1962. While countries like India and Ghana achieved independence through negotiation, Algeria had to fight, brutally, for its freedom. Under French colonial rule for over 130 years, Algeria wasn't just a colony, it was considered an integral part of France. Yet native Algerians were denied equal rights, land, and political power. They were treated as foreigners in their own home. In 1954, the FLN, National Liberation Front, launched an armed struggle against French rule. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most traumatic decolonization conflicts in the 20th century. The Algerian War of Independence involved guerrilla warfare, civilian massacres, systematic torture, and bombings. By the end, over 1 million Algerians had lost their lives. In 1962, after 8 years of war and immense human cost, Algeria finally gained independence. But the violence left deep scars. Post-colonial Algeria entered a new phase of struggle, battling authoritarian regimes, a devastating civil war in the 1990s, and an ongoing search for identity among Arab, Berber, and Islamic traditions. Algeria's path to freedom was not only a war against colonialism, it was a war for the soul of a nation. Southeast Asia, diverging paths in Southeast Asia, decolonization did not follow a single script. Across the region, the struggle for independence took many forms, from diplomatic negotiation to prolonged, bloody war. In Indonesia, nationalists led by Sukarno fought a 4-year war against returning Dutch colonial forces after World War II. After intense resistance and international pressure, Indonesia finally secured its independence in 1949. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh declared independence from France in 1945, inspired by both nationalism and communism. But the French refused to let go. Vietnam was drawn into decades of war, first against French, then against the United States in a Cold War proxy conflict that devastated the country. In contrast, Malaysia achieved independence from Britain peacefully in 1957. But the transition was not without tension. The country faced a communist insurgency and ongoing ethnic divisions between Malay, Chinese, and Indian communities. Across Southeast Asia, the end of colonialism was only the beginning. Each nation faced its own version of post-colonial turmoil, military coups, authoritarian regimes, civil wars, or one-party rule. Despite these challenges, Southeast Asia would emerge as one of the most dynamic and diverse regions in the post-colonial world, forever shaped by its struggles for freedom. Segment 6. Identity and Instability. Ethnic and religious divisions. Colonial borders often carved arbitrary lines, forcing disparate groups into new political entities. These tensions persist in countries like Nigeria, Sudan, and Rwanda, where colonial-era fragmentation contributed to long-term conflict. Without sustainable institutions, many post-colonial states saw clashes between groups vying for political dominance, exacerbated by colonial legacies. Economic dependence on former colonizers. Economic systems established by colonial powers emphasized raw extraction for export, locking post-colonial states into vulnerable, commodity-dependent structure. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah labeled this dynamic as neocolonialism, continuing influence through economic control and foreign corporate power. Military dictatorships and Cold War interference. Weak institutional foundations and modeling after colonial-era militaries made coups and military rule commonplace. By the 1970s, around half of African nations were under military control. Wikipedia. Superpowers often exploited this instability, turning new nations into proxy arenas during the Cold War era. The legacy of decolonization. The fight for independence reshaped the 20th century. It redefined borders, identities, and global power. But the journey continues. Many post-colonial nations still grapple with inequality, corruption, and neocolonialism. Decolonization wasn't the end of history, it was the beginning of a new struggle, to build nations that reflect the dreams, dignity, and diversity of their